Marcus had left his keys on the small wooden ledge by the door, right next to a crumpled receipt from the convenience store down the street. It was just a regular Thursday evening. The children were quiet in their room, and the yellow light of the television cast long, flickering shadows across the hallway. Everything looked exactly as it always did, yet a strange, heavy stillness seemed to cling to the plastic placemats on the kitchen table. Sarah stood by the counter for a long moment, her eyes tracing the dry white ring where a hot coffee mug had rested hours ago. She did not look toward the living room, where the soft, rhythmic clicking of Marcus's phone keypad echoed off the thin walls. She did not ask him about the missing cash or the call from the restricted number that had vibrated against her nightstand at dawn. Instead, she turned the metal handle of the faucet, letting the stream run until it lost its initial rust-colored stain and settled into a lukewarm pour. She plugged the drain. The water in the sink had turned the color of weak tea. Sarah kept her hands submerged anyway, her fingers searching the greasy depths for the last of the plastic forks. The cheap dish soap she bought from the discount bin did not foam well, leaving a thin, oily slick across the surface of the water that caught the yellow light from the overhead bulb. In the living room, the television droned. It was an old sitcom, one of those shows where the laughter was canned and loud, echoing off the thin drywall of the duplex. Marcus was on the sofa. She did not have to look at him to know how he was sitting. He would be slouched, his weight pressed into the sagging left spring of the cushions, one hand hooked into the waistband of his sweatpants, while the other held his phone 3 inches from his face. The wall clock above the stove ticked with a heavy plastic clack. It was always 4 minutes fast, a small defect Sarah had stopped trying to correct 3 years ago. Each tick seemed to vibrate through the linoleum floor, rising through the soles of her worn sneakers and settling into her lower back. She pulled a plastic bowl from the water. It was stained orange from canned spaghetti sauce, a stubborn tint that would never quite wash out. She scrubbed it with the green side of a sponge that had already lost its abrasive texture, leaving only a soft, damp crumble of foam in her palm. Under the microwave, partially hidden beneath a yellowing grocery store circular for cheap chicken thighs, lay the envelope. It was a pale, cheap paper that felt rough to the touch. The landlord had hand-delivered it yesterday, sliding it through the door gap while the children were at school. It did not have a stamp. It only had their name, Miller, written in thick black marker that had bled through to the back. 3 hours ago, that paper had been an active threat. Now it was just a receipt of temporary survival. Sarah rinsed the bowl. The tap water ran cold for a moment before the old water heater in the basement kicked on with a violent rattle, sending a rusty hiss through the pipes. She adjusted the metal faucet, her wet fingers slipping on the lime-scaled handle. She remembered the pawn shop on 10th Street. The air inside had smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap metal polish. The glass counters were crowded with wedding bands, silver-plated tea sets, and power drills with faded owner names scratched into the plastic. The man behind the glass had not looked at her face. He had only looked at her hands. The gold ring had been her grandmother's. It was thin, the band worn flat on the bottom from 50 years of house chores and garden soil. When she placed it on the black velvet pad, it looked incredibly small. The clerk had picked it up with a pair of tweezers, weighed it, and offered her $80. She had not argued. She had simply nodded, signed the yellow slip, and took the 4 $20 bills. Added to the extra shifts she had taken at the dry cleaners over the last 3 weeks, It was exactly enough to stop the eviction process. The landlord had taken the cash without looking her in the eye, grunting as he crossed their name off his legal pad. A floorboard creaked behind her. Marcus walked into the kitchen, his bare feet sliding against the linoleum. He did not look at her. He bypassed the sink entirely, reaching for the refrigerator door. The magnetic seal released with a wet pop, and the interior light flickered twice before settling into a dim, sickly glow. He stared into the shelves, his eyes scanning past the plastic containers of leftover rice and the single carton of milk that was 3 days past its sell-by date. "Is there any of that juice left?" he asked. His voice was thick with evening laziness, his eyes already drifting back down to his phone screen. "Toby drank the last of it with his medicine," Sarah said. Her voice was flat, dry from the bleach water she had used to wipe down the counters earlier. Marcus grunted. He reached for a pitcher of tap water instead, pouring a glass without offering her any. He drank it in 3 long, loud gulps, his throat clicking with each swallow. A drop of water escaped his chin and fell onto his gray sweatshirt, leaving a dark, spreading circle on the fabric. He set the empty glass down on the counter, 3 inches from the sink where she was working. He did not put it in the water. "Did the mail come today?" he asked, his thumb flicking rapidly across his screen. "Just circulars," Sarah replied. He did not question her. He did not ask about the landlord, or the yellow slip, or why the front porch light had been turned off to save electricity. He was already turning back toward the living room, his attention entirely consumed by a digital green felt table on his screen, where small white cards were being dealt by a virtual hand. Sarah watched the dark spot of water on his sweatshirt fade as he walked away. She estimated the energy required to bring up the missing $400 from the joint account. If she spoke now, he would tell her it was a sure thing that fell through. He would tell her she did not understand risk. He would raise his voice, and the sound would carry through the thin bedroom door where Lily was trying to sleep off a low-grade fever. The argument would last 45 minutes. It would leave her chest tight and her head aching behind her eyes. It would change nothing about the empty space on her left ring finger. She calculated the cost. Silence was free. She picked up the glass he had left on the counter, lowered it into the greasy, lukewarm water, and began to scrub. The water stain on the ceiling tile was shaped like a bloated mitten. In the gray dark of 2 a.m, Sarah tracked its outline by the weak light of the street lamp filtering through the vinyl blinds. The apartment was never fully dark. The city streetlights, cheap and orange, bled through the gaps in the plastic slats, casting long, barred shadows across the foot of the bed. Beside her, Marcus slept with his mouth open. His breath was a heavy, rhythmic rasp, occasionally breaking into a soft snort before settling back into a low rumble. He had taken the entire top sheet, wrapping it around his torso like a cocoon, leaving her with only the thin, pilled acrylic blanket that smelled of cheap laundry detergent and old dust. She did not pull at the sheet. To pull it would be to risk waking him, and waking him meant risking a conversation. Her right shoulder ached with a dull, throbbing heat, a reminder of the 6 hours she had spent lifting heavy, damp bundles of linen at the dry cleaners. The smell of perchloroethylene, the sweet chemical solvent they used to clean the suits of men who lived 3 neighborhoods over, seemed to have settled permanently into the pores of her skin. No matter how long she stood under the tepid stream of the shower, the scent lingered, a ghostly reminder of 36 hours of overtime. A sudden sharp vibration cut through the silence. It came from the nightstand on Marcus's side of the bed, a low wooden buzz that rattled a half-empty plastic cup of water he had left there. Sarah did not move. Her eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, but her ears strained. 2 seconds of silence, then another buzz, smaller this time, the short double tap of a text message notification. Marcus did not stir. He only shifted his weight, his heavy leg twitching against the mattress as he mumbled something incoherent into his pillow. Sarah slowly turned her head. The blue-white glow of his phone screen illuminated the side of his face, highlighting the deep, oily creases around his nose and the graying stubble on his jaw. The screen remained lit for 10 seconds, casting a pale, cold square of light onto the cheap laminate of the nightstand before fading back into the dark. She lay perfectly still, her mind ticking like the kitchen clock. The phone was less than 3 feet away. It was not locked with a fingerprint. He used a simple 4-digit PIN that she had memorized 3 years ago when she helped him set up his fantasy football account. She could reach over, slide the glass under her thumb, and read the message. She could see exactly who was demanding money at 2 a.m. She could see if it was the same number that had called him 3 times during dinner last week, the one he had walked into the hallway to answer in a hushed, pleading whisper. But she didn't move her hand. She calculated the metabolic cost of the knowledge. If she read the text, she would have a name. She would have a number. She would have a concrete figure of his debt to add to the $3,000 she had already paid off from the joint savings account, the $1,200 she had borrowed from her sister under the pretense of dental work, and the $80 from her grandmother's ring. But knowing the exact number would not change the amount of cash in her purse. It would not buy the penicillin Lily needed for her ear infection, nor would it pay the electric bill that was currently marked with a red stamp on the kitchen counter. It would only keep her awake for the remaining 3.5 hours before her alarm went off. It would turn her worry into a sharp physical panic that would make her hands shake while she folded the shirts at the shop. She chose the silence. She chose to let the blue light die. The room returned to its orange-gray shadow play. Sarah slid her legs out from under the scratchy acrylic blanket, her feet finding the cold, bare floorboards where the carpet had worn away near the doorway. The wood was cold, sending a sharp shiver up her calves that helped clear the fog from her brain. She slipped out of the room, her movements practiced and silent, avoiding the 3rd floorboard from the door that always creaked when weight was applied to its left side. The hallway was narrow, smelling of old carpet padding and the faint, sweet scent of the cherry cough syrup she had given Lily at 10 o'clock. She walked down to the children's room, her hands sliding along the wall to guide her in the dark. Inside, the air was warmer, trapped by the closed window and the small black box fan that hummed on the dresser. The fan had a loose bearing that caused it to click every few seconds, a sharp tick, tick, tick that sounded like a mechanical insect. She stood by Lily's bed first. The 5-year-old was lying on her side, her small chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. Sarah bent down, pressing the back of her hand against the girl's forehead. The skin was damp, but the dry, burning heat of the afternoon had faded into a cool, clammy sweat. Sarah let out a slow, silent breath. She pulled the thin cotton sheet up over Lily's shoulders, tucking it gently under her chin. Across the small room, Toby was sprawled on the lower bunk, his blanket kicked entirely to the floor. He was 9, old enough to notice the quiet tension that filled the apartment like heavy smoke, but young enough to still believe his mother's lies about why they were having breakfast for dinner 3 nights in a row. She picked up his blanket, shaking out the dust before laying it over him. As she did, her fingers brushed against his plastic action figure, its plastic limbs stiff and cold against her palm. She stood in the center of their room for a long moment, listening to the dual rhythm of their breathing, a soft, fragile counterpoint to the ticking of the fan. This was the only part of the house that felt real to her, the only space where her labor felt like it had a weight that mattered. Outside, in the distance, a car door slammed. The sound was sharp, echoing through the empty street, followed by the low, guttural rev of a bad muffler. Sarah walked back to the kitchen. She did not turn on the light. Instead, she stood by the sink, looking at the clean, wet dishes drying on the plastic rack. The glass she had washed last had a small chip on the rim, a tiny, sharp tooth of glass that she had avoided with her sponge. She sat down at the kitchen table, her eyes focusing on the dark silhouette of the microwave. Underneath it, the space where the eviction notice had been was now empty. She had folded the yellow paper and tucked it deep inside her winter coat in the closet, a place Marcus would never look. The clock on the wall clicked, 2:45. She sat in the dark, her hands clasped in her lap, waiting for the morning to come. The alarm on Sarah's phone did not ring. It vibrated against the wooden surface of the nightstand, a muffled, angry hum that she silenced on the first shake. It was 5:30 in the morning. The room was still dark, but the orange of the street lamp had faded into a cold, leaden gray that clung to the corners of the ceiling. She sat up slowly, her knees clicking in the quiet room. Her lower back was stiff, a sharp knot of tension tightening just above her hip, where she had leaned against the heavy pressing machine at the dry cleaners the day before. She sat on the edge of the mattress for a full minute, her eyes closed, letting the blood slowly return to her head. Beside her, Marcus did not move. He had rolled onto his back, his jaw slack, a soft whistling sound escaping his nose with every breath. His phone lay face down where she had left it, the black glass reflecting the dull light of the window. She slipped her feet into her shoes. They were cheap canvas slip-ons, the soles worn thin enough that she could feel the texture of every floorboard beneath her feet. In the kitchen, the air was cold. The duplex had poor insulation, and the morning draft always seemed to pool in the small hallway outside the bathroom. She turned on the small burner of the stove, the blue flame clicking 3 times before catching with a soft whoosh. She set the old metal kettle over the eye. The copper bottom was black with soot, and the wooden handle was loose, wobbling slightly as the water inside began to whisper. She opened the refrigerator. The light didn't come on this time. The bulb had finally given out. In the dimness, she counted the eggs in the carton. 3 left. She had intended to make scrambled eggs for the kids, but 3 eggs would not stretch between Toby and Lily if she wanted them to have enough protein to keep them full until school lunch. She took out the loaf of white bread. It was the store brand, the plastic bag tied with a yellow wire twist. She took 4 slices, placing them on a battered metal baking sheet to toast under the broiler. Real butter was a luxury they had skipped on the last grocery run, so she pulled the plastic tub of margarine from the shelf. It was nearly empty, the yellow grease scraped thin against the white plastic sides. The kettle began to whistle, a low, breathy pipe that quickly rose to a shrill scream. She lifted it off the heat before it could wake the children. She poured the hot water over a single used tea bag in her mug. It was her 3rd time using the same bag. The liquid that rose to the top was pale, the color of weak straw, with barely any scent of black tea left. She stirred in a spoonful of sugar from a jar that was mostly clumped together from the humidity. A shadow fell across the kitchen doorway. Marcus stood there, his hair wild on one side of his head, his eyes small and red-rimmed. He was still wearing the gray sweatshirt from the night before, the dark spot from the water droplet now a faint, stiff ring on the fabric. He was holding his phone in his right hand, his thumb already twitching against the screen. "Did you touch my phone last night?" he asked. His voice was gravelly, his tone flat, lacking any morning greeting. Sarah did not look up from her tea. She watched the pale brown water swirl in the mug. "No," she said. "It was vibrating," he said, his eyes scanning her face, looking for a twitch, a pause, some sign of a lie. "I thought I heard it." "The wind was rattling the kitchen window," Sarah said, her voice quiet. She picked up a butter knife and began scraping the remaining margarine from the tub, her movements slow and deliberate. The plastic squeaked under the metal blade. It was rattling all night. Marcus stared at her for a moment longer. He did not seem entirely convinced, but the effort required to press the matter was too much for him so early. He let out a long, heavy sigh and leaned against the counter, his shoulder brushing against the edge of the microwave. He began scrolling again. The light from the screen reflected in the dark pupils of his eyes, 2 tiny, glowing rectangles that flickered as his thumb moved. "Is there any coffee?" he asked. "No," Sarah said, spreading the thin yellow grease over the warm toast. "We ran out on Tuesday." He grunted, a sound of mild annoyance, as if the lack of coffee were a personal slight she had planned. He didn't ask why she hadn't bought more. He knew why. Or rather, he chose not to know why. He straightened up and walked toward the bathroom, his bare feet sticking slightly to the linoleum with each step. A moment later, the sound of the pipes groaning signaled that he had turned on the shower. Sarah stood at the counter, her hands resting on the edge of the laminate. She opened her purse, which sat on the small stool by the door. She unzipped the interior pocket and pulled out her wallet. It was a fake leather clutch, the corners peeling to reveal the gray cardboard underneath. She opened it. Inside were 2 $5 bills, 3 ones, and 95 cents in change. $13.95. She calculated the day. The bus pass for her to get to the dry cleaners and back was $3. Toby's lunch account at school was short by $2.50. She had received the automated email 3 days ago, warning her that he would be given a cheese sandwich instead of the hot meal if the balance wasn't paid. Lily's cough syrup, the cheap generic brand from the dollar store, was $4. That left $4.45. If she didn't buy her own lunch at the shop, she would have enough to buy a half-gallon of milk on the way home. If she walked the 2 miles home from the bus stop instead of transferring to the local route, she could save another $1.50. She looked toward the bathroom door. The sound of the running water was steady, a heavy, wasteful drumming against the plastic tub. Marcus would ask for gas money before he left for his shift at the auto parts warehouse. He always did on Thursdays. He would say his tank was on empty, that he wouldn't make it to the highway without $5. If she gave him the $5, the math collapsed. Toby would get the cheese sandwich. Lily would keep coughing through the night. She took one of the $5 bills from her wallet and folded it into a small, tight square, sliding it deep into the watch pocket of her jeans. She took the remaining 5 and the ones, placing them back into the wallet, leaving it open on the counter. Let him see the $8. Let him see exactly how little was left. The bathroom door opened and a cloud of warm, damp steam rolled into the hallway. Marcus emerged, a towel wrapped around his waist, his skin pink from the hot water she had saved for him by washing the dishes in cold. He didn't look at her as he went into the bedroom to dress. Sarah picked up the plate of toast and carried it into the kids' room, her face settling into a soft, practiced smile before she pushed the door open. The commercial steam press came down with a heavy metallic clank. Sarah pulled the lever, holding it down for 3 seconds as a white cloud of superheated steam hissed out from the padded metal plate, engulfing her face in a damp, chemical-scented heat. The air in the back room of the dry cleaners was always thick, a heavy soup of laundry starch, scorched wool, and the sharp, sweet tang of dry cleaning solvent. She lifted the press. The pair of gray trousers on the buck was perfectly creased, the wool stiff and hot to the touch. Her hands were red, the skin around her knuckles raw and peeling from the constant heat and the rough fabric she handled for 8 hours a day. She hung the trousers on a wire hanger, slid a paper shoulder protector over the hook, and pushed the hanger onto the metal rail behind her. The rail groaned, a long, rusty squeal, as the weight of 30 other pairs of trousers shifted an inch to the left. The shop was quiet, save for the rhythmic clank hiss of the press and the low, rattling vibration of the giant tumble dryers in the corner. Her boss, a quiet man named Henderson, who spent most of his day behind the front counter reading old newspapers, did not like his employees standing idle. If the pressing was done, there were shirts to starch. If the shirts were starched, there were sheets to fold. Sarah's phone vibrated in her apron pocket. It was a small, quick pulse, different from the long, heavy vibration of a phone call. She did not answer it immediately. She grabbed another pair of pants, dark blue polyester, and aligned the seams on the pressing buck, smoothing out the wrinkles with her bare palms. Her skin caught on the cheap synthetic fabric, a tiny, raspy sound that was lost in the roar of the exhaust fan. The phone vibrated again. She reached into her apron, her fingers slipping past 3 wooden clothespins and a handful of yellow plastic dry cleaning tags to pull out the device. The screen showed a notification from an unknown number. There was no name, just a 10-digit sequence with a local area code. Sarah glanced toward the front of the shop. Through the steam-fogged glass partition, she could see the back of Henderson's head, his gray hair illuminated by the fluorescent tubes of the front counter. He was on the phone with a customer, his head nodding slowly. She stepped behind the large blue canvas laundry bin, where the damp, heavy sheets were piled, waiting for the ironer. The air here was cooler, smelling of wet cotton and sour water. She tapped the screen. The text was brief. It did not contain threats, but the cold formality of it was worse. This is a reminder regarding the outstanding balance of $580 on account ending in 493. Payment is due by 5 p.m. today to avoid further collection action or contact with secondary references. Sarah stared at the numbers. $580. The account ending in 493 was a small personal line of credit Marcus had opened 18 months ago, supposedly to buy a set of used winter tires for their old station wagon. She had assumed he was paying the monthly $25 minimum. She had seen the white envelopes from the bank arrive, but they had always disappeared into his truck or his pockets before she could open them. Now the minimum payments had stopped. The interest had piled up, and he had listed her number as the secondary contact. She closed the message and opened her calculator app. At $9.50 an hour, after taxes, her take-home pay for a 2-week period was roughly $680. That was 71 hours of standing in this damp room, her shoulders burning, her throat dry from the steam. The $580 Marcus owed was equivalent to 61 hours of her physical life. 61 hours of lifting, pressing, folding, and breathing in chemical fumes. If she paid this debt, Toby's school fees would go unpaid again. The electric company would put them on the deferred payment plan, which meant a $50 penalty next month. Lily would have to wear her winter coat from last year, even though the sleeves ended 3 inches above her wrists. If she did not pay it, the calls would start. They would call her phone while she was at the press. They would call the shop. Henderson would hear the phone ring on the front counter, and he would look at her with that quiet, disappointed frown that meant her job was on the line. He did not tolerate drama. He did not tolerate personal problems that crossed the threshold of his clean, quiet shop. She looked at her red fingers. A droplet of sweat ran down the side of her neck, tracing a cold line through the dust and starch that had settled on her collarbone. She did not call Marcus. She knew what he would say. He would say he had a plan. He would say he was waiting on a check from a side job that didn't exist. He would tell her to calm down, that she was making a big deal out of nothing. Instead, she opened her contacts. She scrolled past her sister, past the school office, and stopped on a name: Richard. Richard was her cousin, a man who worked as an assistant manager at a small independent hardware store 3 towns over. He was a quiet man, 5 years older than Sarah, who lived alone and rarely spoke at family gatherings. 2 years ago, when Sarah's mother had passed away, Richard had offered her a small loan to help with the funeral costs. She had paid him back every penny, 3 days before the deadline they had agreed upon, in a clean white envelope with a short note of thanks. She began to type a message. Richard, I am sorry to ask this. I need a short-term favor. $500. I can pay you back $50 a week starting next Friday. I will sign whatever paper you need. She stood there, her thumb hovering over the blue send button. The exhaust fan in the wall shuddered, a loud metallic clatter that sounded like a handful of gravel being thrown into the blades. If she sent this message, she would be bound to Richard for 10 weeks. 10 weeks of checking her budget down to the penny, of skipping dinners, of feeling that tiny, sharp pinch of shame every time she saw his name in her call history. But if she didn't send it, the foundation of their fragile life would crack. The collectors would call the shop. The landlord would find out. She calculated the weight of the shame versus the weight of the risk. Her thumb dropped. The message was sent. She locked the phone, slid it back into her apron pocket beneath the wooden clothespins, and stepped out from behind the blue canvas bin. The press was waiting. The metal plate had cooled slightly, but as she pulled the lever down again, the steam rose, hot and white, and thick enough to hide the entire world for a few seconds. The wind off the river was damp and smelled of low tide and diesel exhaust. Sarah walked with her chin tucked into the collar of her worn winter coat, her hands shoved deep into her pockets. One of her canvas shoes had developed a tiny split along the outer seam near the pinky toe, and with every step on the wet asphalt, a cold, dirty moisture seeped into her sock. She had bypassed the transfer bus. It would have cost her $1.50 to ride the remaining 12 blocks to the corner of their street. Instead, she chose the 45-minute walk. Her body was a ledger of aches. Her left shoulder was frozen from hours of lifting the iron. Her calves were tight, and her feet felt swollen inside her cheap shoes. But as she walked, she watched the numbers in her head. $1.50 saved. That was 3 boxes of generic macaroni at the discount grocery. It was 3 days of hot lunches for Toby, if she could stretch the balance a little further. In her coat pocket, her fingers curled around her phone. Richard's reply had come at 3 o'clock. It had been brief, written with the same spare, functional language he used at the hardware store. I sent $500 to your account. Do not worry about a paper. Just pay it when you can. Tell the kids I said hello. She had immediately used her phone to transfer the full amount to the collection agency's portal, clearing the $493 account balance. The confirmation screen had flickered for a second before showing a green check mark and a transaction number. Just like that, the threat had vanished back into the digital ether from which it had come. But the debt had not disappeared. It had only changed its face. It was no longer an anonymous voice on the phone threatening legal action. It was now Richard's quiet, serious eyes at the next family Thanksgiving. It was the knowledge that her cousin, a man who worked 48 hours a week in a dusty warehouse, had dipped into his own small savings because she could not keep her own house in order. She turned the corner onto her street. The duplexes here all looked the same, built in the late 70s with cheap wood siding that had warped under decades of rain and humidity. Most of the lawns were patchworks of crabgrass and bare dirt, littered with plastic toys and rusted charcoal grills. A yellow light was burning in the window of their unit. Sarah climbed the 3 concrete steps to the porch, her damp shoe making a soft, squelching sound on the doormat. She turned the key in the lock, her raw fingers stiff and clumsy against the cold metal. As she stepped inside, the heat of the apartment hit her. It was too hot. Marcus had turned the thermostat up to 74. The old baseboard heaters were clicking furiously, dry, dusty air blowing through the small living room. Marcus was on the sofa. He had changed out of his work clothes into a fresh white t-shirt. On the low coffee table in front of him sat a condensation-covered can of a premium blue-branded energy drink and a fresh, unopened pack of brand-name cigarettes. The silver foil on the pack gleamed under the television light. A small, cold knot tightened in Sarah's stomach. Those cigarettes cost $10 a pack. The energy drink was $4. "Where did you get those?" she asked, her voice quiet as she unbuttoned her coat. Marcus did not look up from the television. A football game was playing, the green turf bright and sterile on the screen. "Oh, Todd owed me $20 from last week," he said, his eyes tracking a player running down the sideline. "He finally paid up today when I saw him at the warehouse." The $20 could have gone toward the electric bill. It could have bought the half-gallon of milk they were missing. It could have paid for Toby's school lunch for the next 4 days. Instead, it was sitting on the coffee table in the form of tobacco and blue chemicals. "Did you get the milk?" Marcus asked, his tone casual, as if he were asking about the weather. "No," Sarah said. He finally turned his head, his brow furrowing slightly in annoyance. "Why not?" "Toby's been asking for cereal since he got home from school." "I didn't have enough money," she said. She did not say it with anger. She did not raise her voice. She simply stated it as a physical fact, like the temperature of the room or the split in her shoe. Marcus rolled his eyes and let out a short, scoffing breath. "Come on, Sarah. It's $4. How do you not have $4? You just got paid last week." She did not answer him. She did not tell him about the $580 she had transferred to the collection agency 3 hours ago. She did not tell him about the gold ring that was currently sitting in a velvet tray on 10th Street. She simply hung her coat on the peg by the door, took off her wet shoes, and walked into the kitchen. Toby and Lily were sitting at the small laminate table, their homework papers scattered between them under the harsh light of the overhead bulb. Lily's cheeks were still a little pink, but her breathing was deeper, the rattling sound in her chest gone. "Mom, I'm hungry," Toby said, looking up from a math worksheet. "I'm making dinner now," Sarah said. She opened the cupboard. She took down the box of elbow macaroni she had bought on Monday. She filled the small pot with water and set it on the stove, her movements silent and efficient. She did not reach for the third bowl. Usually she made a large pot, enough for the 4 of them, and then spent 10 minutes scraping the last of the cheese sauce onto Marcus's plate while he watched the game. She would bring it to him on the couch, sliding the small folding tray over his knees so he didn't have to move. Tonight, she only pulled 2 small blue plastic bowls from the cupboard. She measured out exactly 2 portions of pasta. She did not drop a single extra noodle into the boiling water. Marcus came to the kitchen doorway, his phone in his hand, his nose sniffing the air. "Is that just macaroni again?" he asked, his upper lip curling slightly. "We had that on Tuesday." "There is nothing else," Sarah said, her back to him as she stirred the pot with a wooden spoon. "Well, make sure you make enough for me this time," he said, turning back toward the living room. "I'm starving. I didn't get a lunch break today." Sarah watched the white starch foam rise to the top of the boiling water. She reached out and turned the dial, lowering the heat just enough to keep it from spilling over the rim. She said nothing. This was the first shift. It was small, almost invisible, a tiny crack in the foundation that he would not notice until the walls began to lean. She would no longer carry the weight of his hunger. She would only feed the children. The fog on Friday morning was so thick that the houses across the street were nothing but dark, jagged shapes against a gray backdrop. Inside the kitchen, the air was cold enough that Sarah could see the faint white puff of her own breath as she stood by the stove. She was packing the children's school lunches. It was a small, quiet routine. She took 2 pieces of cheap aluminum foil, tearing them from the roll with a sharp metallic zip that echoed through the silent apartment. She wrapped a single slice of American cheese and a piece of bread for Toby, then did the same for Lily. There was no fruit left. There were no juice boxes. She filled 2 plastic water bottles from the tap, the municipal water running cloudy and smelling slightly of chlorine before clearing in the glass. Behind her, the floorboards groaned. Marcus stepped into the kitchen, his shoulders hunched against the cold. He was wearing his blue work shirt, but he hadn't tucked it in, and the collar was bent inward. He looked disheveled, his eyes small and bloodshot, from another night of staring at the blue glare of his phone screen in the dark. He walked straight to the refrigerator and pulled the door open. The empty shelves stared back at him. The single jar of yellow mustard and 3 pickled jalapenos sat on the middle rack like specimens in a neglected museum. He stared into the cold void for a long 5 seconds, his hand resting on the plastic handle, waiting for something to miraculously appear. "There's nothing in here," he said. His voice was scratchy, his tone rising with a mix of disbelief and early morning irritation. "I know," Sarah said, folding the top of Toby's paper bag down twice, pressing the crease flat with her thumb. "Well, what am I supposed to eat for breakfast?" he asked, turning around to face her. He crossed his arms over his chest, his posture defensive. "I have a 9-hour shift today. I can't work on an empty stomach." "There is bread," Sarah said, pointing to the counter where the plastic bag lay, empty, save for the 2 dry crusts at the very end. He looked at the crusts, his mouth twisted in disgust. "You're kidding me, right? You didn't leave me any of the macaroni last night either. I had to eat a sleeve of saltines before bed." "The children needed to eat," she said. Her voice remained level, completely devoid of the defensive heat he was expecting. He stared at her, his brow furrowing. There was a long, heavy silence in the kitchen, broken only by the rhythmic plastic tick of the fast wall clock. He was waiting for her to apologize. He was waiting for her to say she was sorry, that she'd been stressed, that she would go to the store as soon as her shift started. He was waiting for the familiar cycle of her guilt to kick in, the one where she worked herself to exhaustion to make up for his discomfort. But the apology didn't come. Sarah simply picked up the 2 lunch bags, walked past him without making eye contact, and placed them in the children's backpacks by the front door. Marcus followed her into the hallway, his frustration mounting. "Are you mad at me or something? You've been acting weird since yesterday." "No," she said, her voice a flat, smooth stone. "Then what is this?" he asked, gesturing back toward the empty kitchen. "We don't have food, the bills are piled up, and you're just walking around like you don't care?" "I am going to work, Marcus," she said. She picked up her heavy winter coat from the peg, sliding her arms into the stiff sleeves. "We will have money when my paycheck clears next Thursday." He let out a short, angry laugh. "Thursday? That's 6 days from now. What are we supposed to do until then?" She paused, her hand on the doorknob. She looked at him then, really looked at him. She saw the grease on his collar, the slight tremble in his hand, the way his fingers were still twitching toward the pocket where his phone lived. She calculated the exact steps of her day. During her 30-minute lunch break at the dry cleaners today, she would not sit on the wooden bench in the alley eating a dry sandwich. Instead, she would walk 3 blocks to the First National Bank branch on Elm Street. It was not the bank where they kept their joint account, the one Marcus had linked to his online betting profiles, the one that currently sat at a balance of $3.12. It was a different bank, a quiet, old-fashioned building with heavy glass doors and tellers who wore neat blue blazers. She had her driver's license, her Social Security card, and her latest pay stub from Henderson's shop in her purse. She would open a single, individual checking account. She would sign the paperwork to change her direct deposit at the dry cleaners, directing her entire salary into this new, invisible vault. It would take 18 minutes. By this time next week, her money would no longer be a communal resource. It would no longer be the grease that kept his machine running. It would be hers, locked behind a password he did not know, in a building he had never entered. She looked at him, her face completely empty of emotion. "You will have to figure it out," she said. The words were quiet, but they seemed to hang in the damp air of the hallway like frost. Marcus blinked, his mouth opening slightly as if to argue, but no words came out. He was completely unprepared for the absolute lack of friction. He wanted an argument. An argument was something he could win, or at least use to justify his own anger. This quiet, polite wall was something he didn't know how to climb. Toby's bedroom door opened, and the 9-year-old stepped out, his hair messy, his backpack dragging on the carpet behind him. "Morning, Mom," the boy mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Morning, Toby," Sarah said, her voice instantly softening, warming by several degrees. "Put your shoes on. We have to walk fast today." She didn't look at Marcus again. She opened the front door, letting the cold, gray morning fog roll into the hallway, and stepped out onto the concrete porch, her children following close behind her in the quiet dark. The air inside the First National Bank was thin and smelled of pine-scented floor wax and old paper. After 5 hours of standing in the wet, suffocating heat of the dry cleaners, the cool, air-conditioned dryness of the lobby made Sarah's skin feel tight. She stood on the thick blue carpet, waiting for her name to be called, her boots leaving a faint, damp outline of gray slush on the nylon fibers. A man in a neat gray suit gestured to her from a desk behind a low wooden partition. "Mrs. Miller, I'm ready for you." Sarah walked over, keeping her purse tucked tightly under her arm. The man was young, maybe 25, with a gold-plated tie clip and perfectly combed hair that smelled of sweet pomade. His nameplate read, "Alexander Finch, Personal Banker." He smiled, a polite, professional expression that made Sarah feel like a real person, not just a pair of hands that smelled of starch and dry cleaning fluid. "Please, sit down," he said, gesturing to a heavy armchair covered in blue tweed fabric. Sarah sat. The chair was firm, supporting her lower back in a way the sagging couch at home never did. She placed her fake leather purse on her lap, her fingers tracing the peeling seam of the zipper. "I'd like to open a personal checking account," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. "Just for myself." "Of course," Mr. Finch said, his fingers clicking rapidly across his keyboard. He did not ask why she wanted an individual account. He did not look at her worn winter coat or the raw, red skin of her knuckles with suspicion. To him, she was simply a transaction, a new customer who might bring in a small deposit. "Do you have your identification and a secondary form of ID?" She reached into her purse and pulled out her driver's license and her library card, placing them on the polished mahogany desk. Beside them, she laid her latest pay stub from Henderson's dry cleaners. Mr. Finch took the cards, his eyes scanning the details before sliding them into a small scanner. "And will you be setting up direct deposit today?" he asked. "Yes," Sarah said. "I have the employer routing information here. I want my entire paycheck deposited directly into this account." He nodded, printing out a neat white sheet of paper with the bank's blue logo at the top. "This is the direct deposit authorization form. You'll just need to hand this to your payroll representative at work. It usually takes 1 to 2 pay cycles to go into effect, but since your employer is local, it might start as early as next week." Sarah took the paper. It felt heavy, crisp, and clean. It didn't smell like chemicals or stale tobacco. It smelled like dry ink and possibilities. She looked at the numbers printed at the bottom, her new routing number and her new account number. She began her calculation. Her weekly take-home pay was $340. If she worked 5 hours of overtime every Saturday, she could bring that up to $400. To lease the small 2-bedroom apartment above the bakery on 4th Street, she would need first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit. The flyer she had seen in the laundromat window last week listed the rent at $800 a month. $2,400 total. If she lived on nothing but the barest essentials, spending only on the children's medicine and cheap groceries, she could divert $100 a week into this new account. 24 weeks. 6 months. 6 months of living in the same 4 walls as Marcus. 6 months of watching him scroll through his betting apps while the kitchen cupboards grew emptier. 6 months of ignoring his complaints, of pretending she was just tired, of carrying the secret of this white paper in her purse like a small, loaded weapon. Her phone vibrated in her coat pocket. It was a sharp, double pulse. She did not pull the phone out. She knew what the screen would say. Marcus had been texting her since 11 o'clock. His first message had been about his truck's fuel gauge. The second had been a demand for $10 to buy lunch at the warehouse commissary. The third, sent 20 minutes ago, had been more aggressive. "I know you have cash from somewhere. Don't play these games with me, Sarah." She looked at Mr. Finch. He was holding out a heavy, brass-barreled pen, pointing to a small yellow line at the bottom of the signature card. "Just sign here, please," he said. Sarah took the pen. The metal was cool and heavy in her hand. She positioned the tip on the paper and signed her name, Sarah Elizabeth Miller. She wrote it slowly, her cursive neat and precise, just as her grandmother had taught her. As she pressed the pen into the paper, she felt a strange, quiet sense of detachment. She was signing away the last piece of her shared life. She was drawing a line in the dirt, and on her side of the line, she was completely alone. "Here is your temporary debit card," Mr. Finch said, sliding a small gray plastic card across the desk. "It's active immediately. You can make your initial deposit at the ATM in the lobby or with a teller." "Thank you," Sarah said. She stood up, her legs feeling lighter than they had in months. She took her license, her library card, and the folded direct deposit form, sliding them into the deep interior pocket of her coat, where they lay flat against her chest. She walked out of the bank and back onto Elm Street. The fog had cleared, leaving the afternoon light pale and cold. She had 12 minutes left of her lunch break. She walked fast, her canvas shoes slapping against the wet sidewalk, her face set in a calm, empty mask as the cold wind bit into her cheeks. Her phone vibrated again in her pocket. She didn't look at it. She would not look at it until she was back at her machine, where the roar of the steam would drown out any sound he tried to make. The wet winter coat hung from the brass hook behind the kitchen door, dripping onto a folded piece of gray newspaper she had placed beneath it. Tap, tap, tap. The water fell in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, a dark circle expanding outward across the printed supermarket ads of the previous week. Sarah stood at the stove, her eyes fixed on the small bubbles rising around the edges of the aluminum pot. She was heating a single can of generic vegetable soup. It was mostly water, colored pale orange by a few soft cubes of carrot and a handful of swollen celery slices. In the living room, the television was silent, but the room was not quiet. Marcus was pacing. His heavy footsteps moved from the sofa to the front window, then back to the hallway, his bare feet making a dry, sticky sound against the worn carpet. He was holding his phone in his right hand, his fingers tapping against the plastic casing in a rapid, impatient beat. "You didn't answer my texts," he said, stopping in the kitchen doorway. Sarah did not turn around. She picked up a wooden spoon and slowly stirred the soup, watching a pale yellow ring of fat dissolve into the hot broth. "I was working," she said. "For 5 hours?" he asked, his voice rising, thick with a defensive irritation that had been building all afternoon. "I sent you 4 messages. You didn't answer one of them." "My truck almost died on the bypass. I had to coast into the warehouse parking lot. I cannot look at my phone on the line," she said. "Henderson doesn't allow it." "You could have checked it on your break," Marcus said, stepping further into the kitchen. He smelled of cold sweat and the sour metallic grease of the auto parts warehouse. He was standing too close, his shadow falling across her shoulder, blocking the yellow light from the stove bulb. "I asked you for $10, Sarah. Just 10. "There is no money, Marcus," she said. Her voice was flat, as cold and quiet as the air outside the window. He let out a short, sharp breath, a sound that was half laugh, half groan. "Don't lie to me. You had money yesterday. You paid the landlord." "I know you did, because he didn't put the notice on the door today." "Where did you get that cash?" Sarah lifted the spoon, letting the thin broth drip back into the pot. "I sold my mother's ring," she said. The confession was simple. It was the absolute truth, but it was delivered with such lack of emotion that it seemed to stun him for a second. He blinked, his mouth opening slightly before he closed it. His eyes darted to her left hand, which was resting on the edge of the stove. The pale, thin circle of skin on her ring finger was clearly visible under the harsh light. "You sold the ring?" he asked, his voice dropping a fraction. "Why would you do that? That was worth something. You should have told me. I could have got a better price for it. I know a guy on 7th Street who does estate jewelry." "It was enough to pay the landlord," she said. "Well, what about the rest of it?" he asked, his tone shifting instantly from surprise back to his familiar demanding irritation. A gold ring like that has to be worth more than 1 month's rent. You must have had some left over." "There was $80 left," she said. "I used it for Lily's medicine and Toby's lunch account." She did not mention the $500 she had borrowed from Richard. She did not mention the collection agency. She let him believe the $80 was the end of it, the absolute bottom of the well. Marcus stared at her, his jaw tightening. He was looking for a crack, some sign that she was hiding something from him. He knew her too well. He knew when she was holding back her tears, when she was trying to keep from screaming. But there were no tears tonight. Her face was as smooth and empty as a freshly pressed sheet. "I needed $10, Sarah," he muttered, his thumb beginning to scroll through his phone again, his eyes drifting back to the screen. "Just 10. I had a line on a game tonight, a real sure thing. If I put 10 down, I could have turned it into 80 by midnight. We could have had groceries tomorrow, real groceries, not this canned garbage." The soup began to boil, a thick white foam rising to the top. Sarah turned the burner off. She took 2 small blue bowls from the cabinet and set them on the counter. She did not look at him. "The game is a risk," she said. "It's not a risk if you know the stats," he snapped, his voice sharp with the frustration of a man who had been denied his fix. "But you don't get it. You never have. You just want to play the martyr. You want to walk around with that quiet, miserable face so everyone thinks I'm the bad guy." He turned on his heel and walked back into the living room, his bare feet slapping against the linoleum. Sarah stood by the stove. She calculated the emotional cost of his words. 5 minutes ago, a younger version of her would have argued. She would have reminded him of the $400 he had taken from the electric bill money last month. She would have pointed to the empty refrigerator, the thin blanket on the bed, the raw skin on her own knuckles. She would have begged him to see what he was doing to them. But she didn't have the energy for a 45-minute fight. Her energy was a finite resource now, a small pool of oil that she had to keep strictly for herself and the children. To argue with him was to pour that oil onto the dirt. She chose the silence. She ladled the thin soup into the 2 blue bowls, split the 2 dry crusts of bread between them, and carried the plates into the kids' room. Through the thin wall, she could hear the television in the living room click on. The sound of a sports commentator's voice, rapid and enthusiastic, began to fill the apartment. A loud, artificial noise that did not quite hide the sound of Marcus's thumb clicking against the glass of his phone, over and over in the dark. The yellow laundry soap was hard and smelled of tallow and cheap pine. Sarah knelt on the cracked linoleum of the bathroom floor, her knees resting on a folded bath towel that had worn thin in the middle. She leaned over the side of the tub, her forearms submerged in 4 inches of lukewarm water that had already turned a dull, cloudy gray. She was washing Toby's school trousers by hand. Without a working washing machine in the duplex, laundry was a physical battle. The shared washer in the basement of the building cost $2.50 a cycle, and the dryer was another $2. Today, she didn't have the quarters. She had 4 quarters left in her purse, and those had to be saved for the bus on Monday morning. She gripped the stiff denim of the trousers, rubbing the fabric against itself over the rim of the plastic wash basin. The water sloshed against the porcelain tub with a heavy, hollow splash. Her hands were numb from the cold water, the skin on her knuckles pale and wrinkled like old paper. In the corner of the bathroom, right next to the rusted baseboard heater, sat Marcus's laundry pile. It was a mountain of dark, stiff fabric. His blue warehouse shirts, thick with the smell of sweat and forklift oil, lay tangled with his dirty socks and grass-stained jeans. Normally, Sarah would have sorted through this pile first. She would have carried it down the narrow, dark stairs to the basement, used her own hard-earned quarters, and spent her Saturday afternoon folding his shirts so they would be crisp for his Monday shift. Today, she didn't touch it. She stepped over the blue cotton shirts, her bare feet careful to avoid the damp hem of his jeans. She rinsed Toby's trousers, twisting the fabric until her wrists ached, forcing the gray water out in a thick, slow stream that gurgled down the drain. The bathroom door creaked open. Marcus stood in the doorway, his eyes half closed, his hands scratching his bare stomach. He looked down at her, then looked at the tub, and finally looked at his own pile in the corner. "Are you doing laundry?" he asked. His voice was thick with sleep. "I'm washing Toby's trousers," Sarah said, without looking up. She grabbed one of Lily's small white cotton undershirts and began to rub the collar with the soap bar. "Well, did you wash my work shirts yet?" he asked, his voice shifting into a whiny, demanding register. "I've only got one clean shirt left in the closet, and the collar on that one is frayed." "No," she said. He stood there for a second, waiting for the rest of the sentence. He waited for her to say she was going to do them next, or that she was waiting for the water to warm up, or that she needed him to carry the basket down to the basement. But she just kept scrubbing. The yellow soap bar made a wet, rhythmic clicking sound against the plastic rim of the tub. "What do you mean, no?" he asked, his tone sharpening. "I have to work on Monday, Sarah. I can't wear a dirty shirt to the warehouse. The supervisor is already on my back about the uniform code." "I don't have the money for the machine," she said, her voice flat and completely free of apology. He gestured to the tub. "You're doing theirs. Why can't you just throw my shirts in there with them? It's the same water." "The water is dirty," she said, pointing to the gray soapy liquid in the basin. "And your shirts have grease on them. It would ruin Toby's school clothes." "Well, run another tub," he said, his arms crossing over his chest. He was growing more annoyed now, his face reddening slightly around his jawline. "It's not that hard." Sarah stopped scrubbing. She rested her wet, raw hands on the edge of the plastic basin, her eyes remaining fixed on the white cotton undershirt. She calculated the exact value of her labor. At her job at the dry cleaners, she was paid $9.50 an hour to handle other people's dirty clothes. To wash, dry, fold, and iron Marcus's laundry every week took roughly 4 hours of her time. That was $38 a week of free, unappreciated labor she had been donating to him for 9 years. Over 9 years, that was nearly $18,000 of her physical life she had spent keeping him clean while he spent his own money on digital cards and offshore betting lines. She looked up at him. Her eyes were calm, dark, and completely empty of the guilt he was trying to summon. "If you want your shirts washed, you will have to wash them yourself," she said. Marcus stared at her, his mouth dropping open. He looked genuinely shocked, as if the water tap in his kitchen had suddenly looked him in the eye and refused to turn on. He had never had to wash his own clothes. When they had met, his mother had done his laundry. The day they moved in together, Sarah had taken over the chore without a second thought. To him, clean clothes were a natural occurrence, like rain or the morning light. "Are you serious?" he muttered, his voice dropping into a low, threatening growl. "You're going to be like this over a couple of dollars?" "It's not about the dollars, Marcus," she said. "Then what is it about?" he asked, stepping closer, his shadow blotting out the small window light. "Why are you acting like this? You're acting like you don't even care if I have a job." "I have to hang Toby's clothes to dry," she said, turning back to the tub. "The air in the apartment is cold. It will take them 24 hours to dry on the rack." She picked up the wet denim trousers and wrung them out one last time, ignoring him completely. Marcus let out a loud, frustrated grunt. He kicked the side of his own laundry pile, sending a pair of dirty socks sliding across the wet linoleum, and slammed the bathroom door behind him. Sarah did not flinch. She picked up the stray socks, set them back on his pile, and carried her children's clean, damp clothes out to the folding rack by the heater, her face set in a quiet, unbreakable silence. The black cotton thread was thin, but it was strong enough to hold the seam of Lily's winter coat together. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her back straight, her fingers moving with steady, rhythmic precision. She pulled the needle through the heavy, worn wool, the metal clicking softly against her plastic thimble with each stitch. Outside, the Saturday afternoon was dying. The sky had turned the color of greasy dishwater, casting a flat gray light through the kitchen window that made the dirty glass look even older than it was. In the living room, the television was off, but the quiet of the house was broken by a different sound. It was the tinny, mechanical voice of an automated phone system coming from the speaker of Marcus's phone. He was sitting on the sofa, his elbows on his knees, his head hanging low as he stared at the screen. "To repeat this information, press 9, the automated voice said, its tone cheerful and synthetic. "For transaction history, press 2. Marcus pressed a button with a hard, angry tap of his thumb. The voice paused, a faint static hiss filling the room before it returned. "Your current available balance is negative $48.12. Marcus cursed under his breath, his thumb hitting the red end call button. The screen went black, reflecting his tense, frustrated face in the dark glass. He stood up, the old sofa springs groaning in protest, and began to pace the narrow strip of carpet between the television and the front door. Sarah did not look up from her sewing. She kept her eyes on the small, neat stitches she was placing along the cuff of Lily's sleeve. "Did you buy something?" Marcus asked, his voice tight as he stopped at the edge of the kitchen linoleum. "No," she said, pulling the thread tight. "Well, the account is negative," he said, his tone accusing, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of guilt. "It was fine on Wednesday. I had $35 in there. Now it's negative 48. They charged an overdraft fee." "What did you use the card for?" "I haven't touched the joint card since last week," she said. "That's impossible," he muttered, running a hand through his messy hair. "The bank doesn't just take money. Somebody had to spend it. Did you set up an automatic payment or something? What about the internet bill? Did that go through? The internet bill is $52, Sarah said, her voice remaining perfectly level. It goes through on the 10th of every month. It has for 3 years. Marcus froze. He stared at her, his mind struggling to connect the dates. The 10th. Yesterday had been the 10th. He had forgotten. He had assumed the money in the account was his to use, forgetting the silent automatic drafts that kept their lights on and their water running. To him, those bills were invisible things that resolved themselves in the background, like the trash being collected on Tuesday mornings. "Why didn't you tell me it was going to draft?" he asked, his voice rising in irritation. "You knew I was short this week. You should have told me to put some cash in there." "There is no cash, Marcus," she said, tying a neat knot at the end of the seam and clipping the thread with a small pair of silver scissors. The metal made a sharp, clean snip. He let out a long, heavy breath, his shoulders sagging. "This is great, just great. Now I'm overdrawn and I don't get paid until next Friday. How am I supposed to get gas? How am I supposed to do anything?" He turned his back on her, his fingers already flying across his phone screen. A moment later, she heard him make a call. He walked into the hallway, his voice dropping into a low, pleading murmur as he spoke to whoever was on the other end of the line.
"Yeah, man, it's Marcus," he said, his tone completely different now, artificial, friendly, trying to sound casual. "Listen, I'm in a bit of a spot. My wife's payroll got messed up at the cleaners, some direct deposit glitch. Yeah, they're sorting it out, but it won't clear until Monday. I was wondering if you could slide me $50 until then, just to get me through the weekend." There was a pause. Sarah could hear the faint, muffled sound of a male voice vibrating through the phone speaker, but she couldn't make out the words. Marcus's face fell. The friendly smile vanished from his expression, leaving only the raw, tense desperation underneath. "Right, yeah," he said, his voice dropping. "No, I get it. Times are tight. Yeah, no worries, man. I'll talk to you later." He hung up, his arm dropping to his side. Sarah set Lily's coat down on the table. It was finished. The cuff was strong again, the tear hidden beneath a neat black line of thread. She reached into her apron pocket, her fingers brushing against the cool, smooth plastic of her new private debit card. On Monday, her paycheck would not go into the joint account. The $52 for the internet had already cleared, leaving the joint account in the red, but next week the electric bill would arrive. The electric bill was $85. It was under Marcus's name. For 9 years she had watched the calendar, transferring her own money into the joint account a day before the electric bill drafted to ensure his name was never associated with a late payment or a collection notice. She had protected his credit rating as if it were a fragile glass ornament, while he shattered hers without a second thought. She looked at her calendar on the wall. The electric bill was due on the 15th. She calculated the energy required to pay it. It would take $85 of her new savings. It would mean delaying her deposit on the 4th Street apartment by another week. The energy required to do nothing was zero. She would let the bill go unpaid. She would let his name receive the red warning letter. She would let the power company send the notice to his phone, the one he stared at for 12 hours a day. She stood up, carrying Lily's coat to the closet. Marcus was back on the couch, his face illuminated by the blue light of his screen, his fingers tapping the glass in a slow, defeated rhythm. He was trapped in his own small world of numbers and losses, completely unaware
that the walls of his cage were already beginning to close. The red spiral notebook had a grease smudge on the cardboard cover, right next to Toby's name, which was written in shaky, childlike cursive. It was an old-school notebook, half of its pages already filled with spelling lists and simple addition problems from the previous year. Sarah sat at the kitchen table in the quiet dark of 10:30. The only light came from the small fluorescent bulb above the sink, which gave the room a cold green tint. She took a cheap blue ballpoint pen, the plastic cap chewed flat at the end, and scribbled on the margin of a grocery store flyer until the dry ink began to flow in a thin, scratching line. She turned to the very back of the notebook, skipping 20 pages of Toby's neat spelling columns, and found a clean, blank sheet of white paper with blue horizontal lines. She began to write. She did not write a diary. She did not write down how tired she was, or how her knuckles burned from the dry cleaning steam, or how her mother's ring had looked on the black velvet pad. She wrote numbers. October 14th, $300. Cash taken from the rent envelope in the dresser drawer. November 3rd, $450. Direct withdrawal from the joint savings account, labeled as an online transfer to a digital payment portal. December 8th, $580. Outstanding balance on personal credit line ending in 493, paid via personal loan from Richard. December 10th, pawn ticket number 7429, gold band 10 carat, $80 cash received. She wrote each entry with a small, precise hand, keeping the letters perfectly aligned between the blue lines. She was creating a ledger. If she went to the legal aid office on 10th Street, the one that offered free consultations for low-income mothers on Tuesday afternoons, she would need more than her word. She would need a timeline. She would need proof that her husband's debts were not hers, that his losses had systematically stripped the food from his children's mouths. The television in the living room was still on, but Marcus had stopped pacing. Through the doorway, she could see his legs stretched out on the sofa. He was lying on his back, his face illuminated by the pale blue glare of his phone. Every few minutes, his thumb would flick upward, his face twitching slightly in the cold light as he refreshed a screen that showed him nothing but empty promises. The floorboard in the hallway creaked. Sarah did not jump. She did not panic. She simply took the grocery store flyer, the one advertising cheap chicken thighs and yellow onions, and slid it over the open page of the notebook, covering the columns of numbers with a colorful wall of discounts. Marcus walked into the kitchen. He was barefoot, his gray socks left somewhere on the living room floor. He walked with a heavy, dragging stride, his shoulders slouched. "Do we have any aspirin?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. "In the cabinet," Sarah said, her hand resting flat on top of the grocery flyer. He opened the small white cabinet above the sink. He rumbled through the bottles, his fingers knocking over a jar of cheap vitamins and a half-empty bottle of Lily's cough syrup. The plastic bottles made a hollow, rattling sound against the wooden shelf. He found the generic aspirin bottle, shook 2 white tablets into his palm, and swallowed them dry with a grimace. He did not ask for a glass of water. "My head is splitting," he muttered, leaning his forehead against the cool white surface of the refrigerator door. "I think the draft in the warehouse is giving me a cold." Sarah looked at his back. The seam on his gray sweatshirt was still ripped, the small tuft of white fleece sticking out like a tiny tail. The energy required to say, "You should lie down," was 10 units. The energy required to say, "I will make you some tea," was 20 units. The energy required to remain silent was 0. She watched him lean against the refrigerator, his eyes closed, his breathing heavy and uneven. He was 32 years old, but in the green light of the kitchen, he looked older, his face soft and defeated, his skin the color of damp paste. He was waiting for her to say something. He was waiting for her to ask him how his head felt, or if he wanted her to rub his shoulders, or if she could find his thick wool socks. For 9 years she had been his buffer against the world, the one who smoothed out his discomforts and absorbed his pain so he could keep pretending he was a man who had everything under control. She remained silent. Marcus opened his eyes, looking at her out of the corner of his eye. "You're quiet tonight," he said. "I'm tired," she said. He let out a short, tired sigh and turned away from the refrigerator. "Yeah, we're all tired. It's been a long week." He walked back into the living room, his bare feet sliding over the cold linoleum, and threw himself back onto the sofa. A moment later, the blue light of his phone flared up again, casting his shadow against the wall behind him. Sarah waited until the room was quiet again. She slid the grocery flyer aside. She picked up her blue pen and wrote one more entry at the bottom of the page. December 12th, $48.12. Overdraft fee on joint account due to automatic draft for internet service. She looked at the total. The filing fee for a divorce petition at the county courthouse was $250. If she kept her overtime hours on Saturdays, and if she didn't buy a single cup of coffee or a bus transfer for the next 3 weeks, she would have the $250 by the first Tuesday of the new year. She closed the notebook. She slid it into the thin space between the microwave and the side of the wooden cabinet, a dark, narrow crevice where only dust and old coupons accumulated. She turned off the kitchen light, leaving the room in complete darkness, and walked down the hallway to her children's room, her steps light and silent on the cold floor. The public library on Pine Street smelled of damp brick, yellowing paper, and the dry, metallic heat of old radiators. It was one of the few places in the neighborhood that was warm on a Sunday morning and did not require a purchase to sit. Sarah sat in a high-backed wooden chair at computer terminal number 4. The plastic keyboard was old, the letters on the E and S keys completely rubbed away by thousands of greasy fingertips. Beside her, in the children's corner, Toby was sitting on a low carpeted step, turning the pages of a book about deep-sea creatures, while Lily quietly arranged plastic-colored pegs into a wooden grid. She had left Marcus on the couch. When she had gathered the children at 8:30, he had barely opened his eyes. He had mumbled a question into his pillow, his voice thick and dry. "Where are you going?" "To the library," she had said, adjusting Lily's knit cap. He had turned back toward the cushions, pulling the thin sheet over his shoulder. "Get some bread if you can," he had grunted, his hand already reaching blindly toward the floor for his phone. She had not replied. Now she stared at the glowing monitor. The screen had a faint horizontal flicker that made her eyes water if she looked at it too long. She had logged in using her library card, the plastic barcode on the back worn thin and scratched from years of use. On the screen was a blank application form. It was the rental application for the 4th Street apartment, the one above the bakery. The landlord's email address was listed at the bottom, rental@4thstreet.com. She moved the heavy gray mouse, its rubber roller ball sticking slightly on the plastic mat, and clicked the print button. Across the room, the library's central printer let out a loud mechanical hum, followed by the dry, rhythmic squeal of the rollers feeding a fresh sheet of paper through the machine. Sarah got up from her chair. She walked over to the circulation desk where the printer sat on a low wooden counter next to a plastic coin box. The sheets of paper slid into the metal tray, warm to the touch and smelling of ozone. She printed 4 pages in total. The first page was the rental application. The second was a list of required documents, 2 recent pay stubs, a copy of her driver's license, and a landlord reference. The third page was a printout of her new direct deposit authorization, proving her income would soon flow into a solo account. The fourth page was a legal aid intake form. The library clerk, an older woman with thin silver-rimmed glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck, did not look up as Sarah approached. She kept her eyes on a stack of returned books, stamping each one with a small red ink pad. "That'll be 40 cents, the clerk said, her voice a soft mechanical rasp. Sarah reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out her small change purse, unzipping the metal teeth with a quiet click. Inside were her remaining coins, 5 quarters, 1 dime, and 1 nickel. $1.40. She counted out 1 quarter, 1 dime, and 1 nickel, placing them on the laminate counter. They made a small metallic clink on the hard surface. The clerk swept the coins into a plastic drawer with a single, practiced movement of her hand. Sarah picked up the 4 warm sheets of paper. She folded them carefully into thirds, pressing the creases flat with her thumb, and slid them into the deep interior pocket of her winter coat. They sat flat against her chest, right next to her new checking account card. She walked back to the computer terminal and logged off, her fingers leaving a small, clean spot on the greasy plastic of the space bar. She stood by the children's section, watching her kids. Toby was pointing at a picture of a giant squid, his face bright with curiosity. Lily was humming a quiet, wordless song as she placed a blue peg into the wooden board. For a moment, the air in the library felt safe. It was clean. It was quiet. Nobody was screaming about lost money or demanding gas cash. Nobody was staring at a phone with bloodshot eyes, waiting for a green felt table to resolve their future. Sarah calculated the distance. From the 4th Street apartment to the kids' elementary school was 4 blocks. Toby could walk there by himself in 10 minutes. The bus stop for the dry cleaners was right at the corner, and the route did not require a transfer. She could save $1.50 every day on her commute, which meant $30 a month she could put back into her savings. It was a perfect circle, a small, tight geometry of survival that did not include Marcus. But she still had 24 weeks, 6 months of pretending. 6 months of letting the kitchen cabinets grow emptier while she quietly diverted her salary into the First National Bank. 6 months of stepping over his dirty laundry, of listening to his empty promises, of watching him sink deeper into the quicksand of his own creation. She walked over to Toby and gently touched his shoulder. "Come on, sweetie," she said, her voice a soft whisper. "It's time to go home." Toby looked up, his face falling slightly, but he did not argue. He closed the book, sliding it carefully back onto the shelf. Lily stood up, dusting her knees with her small hands, and reached for Sarah's fingers. They walked out of the library, the heavy wood and glass doors closing behind them with a soft pneumatic hiss. The Sunday morning air was cold and crisp, the pale yellow sun doing nothing to warm the damp concrete of the sidewalk. Sarah held her children's hands tightly as they walked back down Pine Street, her face set in a calm, unbreakable mask, her chest feeling the slight, stiff warmth of the folded papers tucked safe against her heart. The brown skin of the potato came off in a thin, continuous curl. Sarah held the small paring knife with her thumb pressed against the cold, wet flesh of the vegetable, her hand moving in a slow, circular motion. It was the second of 3 potatoes she had found in the bottom of the plastic mesh bag under the sink. They were small, slightly soft, with tiny white sprouts beginning to bud from the eyes, but they were still good enough to boil. She was making a simple potato mash for the children's dinner. She had no milk and no butter, so she would use the boiling water and a pinch of salt to smooth out the lumps. In the living room, the television was loud. It was a hockey game now, the sound of skates scraping on ice and the roar of the crowd rising in sudden, violent bursts. Marcus walked into the kitchen. He was wearing his thin gray hoodie, the hood pulled up over his head, despite the heat of the apartment. He had a pencil behind his ear and a small scrap of paper in his hand, covered in scribbled names and numbers. He stopped near the counter, his eyes drifting to her purse, which sat on the small stool by the pantry. Sarah did not stop peeling. She dropped the second potato into the pot of cold water. It fell with a soft, heavy plop, sending a few cold droplets onto her wrist. "Your sister," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a low, tentative tone. "She got her bonus from the school district yet?" Sarah kept her eyes on the third potato. "My sister doesn't get her bonus until the spring," she said. "What about your cousin Richard?" he asked, stepping closer. He leaned his hip against the counter, his thumb flicking the edge of the scrap paper. "He's doing all right at the hardware store. He's always got a little extra. I was thinking I could give him a call, just to ask for $100 to get us through to my paycheck. I could pay him back next Friday, direct." A cold, sharp needle of panic touched Sarah's spine. If Marcus called Richard, the entire structure of her lie would collapse. Richard would mention the $500 he had already sent her on Friday. Marcus would realize she had received a large sum of cash, that she had paid the collection agency, and that she was hiding money from him. He would demand to know where the rest of it was. He would search her purse, find the new First National Bank debit card, and realize what she was doing. She did not let her hand shake. She sliced a small dark spot out of the potato with the tip of the knife. "Do not call Richard," she said, her voice quiet and firm. "Why not?" Marcus asked, his brow furrowing in irritation. "He's family. Family is supposed to help when things are tight." "He is fixing his roof," she said, inventing the detail without a moment of hesitation. "He had to pay for the materials last week. He doesn't have $100 to spare. He's short himself." Marcus let out a long, frustrated breath through his nose.
Everybody's short. It's like nobody's got a dime in this whole town." He looked back toward her purse. He stepped toward the stool, his hand reaching out. "Is there really nothing in your wallet? Not even a 5? I just need to get some tobacco, Sarah. My head is killing me." "Look for yourself," she said. She did not try to stop him. She did not grab her purse or pull it away. She kept her back to him, rinsing the third potato under the cold tap. She heard the rattle of the metal zipper. She heard the dry rustle of the cardboard-backed wallet opening and the soft clink of the remaining coins she had brought back from the library. Marcus let out a disgusted scoff. $1.40. You've got to be kidding me. How are we supposed to live on $1.40 for the next 4 days? "We have potatoes," Sarah said. "We have bread. The children have their school lunches paid for." "That's not living, Sarah," he snapped, slamming her purse back onto the stool. "That's just breathing. You're fine with it because you like playing the martyr, but I've got to go to work. I've got to look people in the eye. I can't do that when I smell like stale water and haven't had a real meal in 3 days." He turned and walked back into the living room, his heavy steps vibrating through the floorboards. Sarah stood at the sink. She calculated the risk of her winter coat. She had left the coat hanging on the hook behind the kitchen door. The 4 folded papers from the library, the rental application, the direct deposit slip, and the legal aid form, were still in the interior breast pocket. Marcus was frustrated. He was desperate. When he was in this state, he would often grab her coat to run to the dumpster or to walk to the corner store to see if the clerk would front him a pack of cigarettes. If he put his hand in the pocket, he would find them. She had to move them, now. She waited until she heard the television commentator announce the start of the second period. She turned the stove burner on under the potato pot, the blue flame catching with its familiar, soft whoosh. She walked quietly to the door. She slid her hand into the interior pocket of her hanging coat, her fingers closing around the folded sheets of paper. They made a faint, dry rustle, but the sound was completely swallowed by the roar of the television crowd. She slipped the papers into the waistband of her jeans, pulling her apron down to cover the shape of them. She walked down the short hallway to her bedroom. In the corner, next to the old wooden dresser, sat her blue plastic sewing box. It was a cheap, dusty container filled with tangled spools of thread, rusty safety pins, and scraps of leftover fabric from her grandmother's sewing basket. Marcus never touched it. To him, it was a useless pile of household labor, a box of chores he had no interest in understanding. She knelt by the box. She opened the plastic latch with a quiet click. She lifted the top tray, which held the needles and the small scissors, and reached down into the very bottom of the container, beneath the heavy bundles of dark wool yarn. She slid the folded papers flat against the blue plastic bottom. She covered them with the yarn, then replaced the tray and snapped the latch shut. They were safe. They were buried beneath 30 years of thread and buttons, a tiny paper foundation of a life he could not see. She stood up, smoothing her apron down over her jeans, and walked back to the kitchen to check on the boiling water, her face as calm and empty as the cold winter sky outside. The smell of cheap synthetic pine body spray was so thick in the small hallway that it made Sarah's eyes sting. Marcus stood in front of the bathroom mirror, holding his phone in one hand while he violently shook an aerosol can with the other. He had put on one of his dirty blue warehouse shirts from the pile in the corner. It was wrinkled, the collar gray with grease, but he had tried to smooth it out by hanging it near the shower steam.
Now he was trying to drown the smell of old sweat and forklift oil in a cloud of chemical citrus. He did not look at her when she walked past. His jaw was set, his movements tight with a silent, simmering rage. He had spent 20 minutes searching his dresser drawers for a clean shirt, slamming each one shut with a loud wooden crack that had woken Lily 20 minutes before her alarm. He had found nothing. Sarah did not offer to help. She did not suggest he wear his gray hoodie over the shirt to hide the collar. She simply walked into the children's room, helped Lily slide her arms into the newly mended winter coat, and handed Toby his backpack. Marcus left the apartment first. He walked out the front door without saying a word, slamming it so hard the cheap glass pane in the center rattled against its wooden frame. A moment later, the wet, sputtering roar of his truck's engine signaled his departure, the tailpipe letting out a loud, metallic backfire before the vehicle rumbled down the street. Sarah waited 5 minutes. Then she took her children's hands and stepped out into the cold, gray Monday morning. By 7:45, she was standing in the back room of Henderson's dry cleaners. The shop was freezing. The heavy steam boilers in the basement had only just been turned on, and their low, rhythmic thumping vibrated through the concrete floor, a deep shudder that Sarah felt in the arches of her feet. The air smelled of cold iron, dry cleaning solvent, and the stale, damp scent of laundry waiting to be sorted. Mr. Henderson was in his small, glass-walled office at the back of the shop, sitting at a metal desk that was cluttered with receipts and yellow legal pads. He was an older man, his hands spotted with liver spots, his eyes watery behind thick bifocals. He was drinking black coffee from a stained ceramic mug, the steam rising in a thin, lazy curl against the fluorescent light. Sarah walked to the glass door and knocked twice. Mr. Henderson looked up, nodding slowly. "Come on in, Sarah." She stepped inside, her canvas shoes making a soft squeak on the linoleum. She reached into her apron pocket, her fingers finding the crisp, folded direct deposit authorization form she had taken from her sewing box before leaving the house. "I have a form for the payroll, Mr. Henderson," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not waver. He took off his glasses, letting them hang from a black cord around his neck, and reached out his hand. He took the white paper, his thumb smoothing out the crease she had made when folding it. "Changed your bank," he said. It wasn't a question, just a slow observation as his eyes scanned the blue logo of the First National Bank at the top of the sheet. "Yes," she said. "I needed to move to a branch closer to where I'm planning to live. The other one was getting difficult to manage." Mr. Henderson looked at her over his bifocals. He had been running this shop for 30 years. He had seen dozens of women come and go through his back room, women with tired eyes and bruises they tried to hide under heavy starch, women who suddenly needed their paychecks in cash or wanted to change their accounts without their husbands knowing. He did not ask questions. He did not offer advice. In his business, survival was a quiet affair. He placed the paper in a black plastic tray on the corner of his desk. "Gable is coming in this afternoon to run the numbers," he said, his voice flat. "She'll have this in for Thursday's run. Your money will go there starting this week." "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," she said. She turned and left the office, the glass door clicking shut behind her. She walked back to her station at the steam press. She pulled the heavy metal lever, and the press came down with its familiar, loud clank. A white plume of boiling steam erupted around her face, hot and wet, warming her cold cheeks and dampening her hair. She began her calculation. The bookkeeper, Mrs. Gable, would input the new routing number by 3 o'clock today. On Thursday morning, $340 would land in her new individual account at First National Bank. Marcus's joint account would remain at negative $48.12. He would not receive his own paycheck from the warehouse until Friday afternoon. When his check cleared, the bank would immediately deduct the $48.12 to cover the overdraft, leaving him with less than he expected. More importantly, his automatic transfers, the small $30 drafts he had set up to fund his digital sports betting portals every Friday morning, would trigger. Without her paycheck there to act as a cushion, those automatic drafts would hit an empty vault. They would bounce. The bank would charge him an additional $35 fee for every single rejected transaction. By Friday night, his account would be drowning in penalties, his betting profiles frozen, his credit rating taking a sharp, deep dive into the red. She pulled the lever, lifting the press. The pair of trousers on the buck was perfectly flat, the crease sharp enough to cut paper. She had did nothing to hurt him. She had not stolen his money. She had not ruined his clothes. She had simply removed her hands from his machine, and without her grease, the gears were already beginning to grind each other to dust. She picked up the next hanger, her raw, red fingers moving with a quiet, terrifying efficiency as the steam rose around her like a curtain. The smell of white vinegar was clean and sharp, cutting through the heavy, sweet scent of the pine body spray that still hung in the kitchen air. Sarah was wiping down the laminate countertop with an old cotton rag she had torn from a stained bedsheet. She didn't use the multi-surface spray anymore. The bottle was empty, and she had refused to spend $3 of her hidden cash to replace it. Outside, the December wind was picking up, rattling the loose glass pane in the kitchen window with a steady, dry chatter. A cold draft slid across the floorboards, pooling around her ankles. She had turned the thermostat down to 60 degrees when she got home from the dry cleaners. The apartment was cold, the kind of deep, quiet chill that settled into the plaster walls and made every corner feel damp. On the kitchen table, sitting right beneath the plastic sugar bowl, lay a bright yellow envelope. It had arrived in the afternoon mail. It didn't have a stamp. It was a hand-delivered notice from the Municipal Power Company. Printed across the front in bold black letters was the word, "Warning." The door lock clicked and Marcus stepped into the hallway. He didn't take off his boots. He walked straight into the living room, his arms wrapped tightly around his chest, his shoulders hunched. He stopped near the hallway, his face twisting in annoyance as he looked at the thermostat dial on the wall. "Why is it freezing in here?" he asked, his voice sharp with the cold. "It's like an icebox." "I turned the heat down," Sarah said, her hand moving in a steady, circular motion as she wiped the counter. "Well, turn it up," he said, walking over to the dial. He grabbed the plastic casing, turning it with a loud mechanical click until it pointed to 72. The old copper pipes in the baseboard heaters let out a sharp metallic ping as the hot water began to slowly move through the system. "We're going to freeze the kids. The electric bill is due," Sarah said, her voice flat, her eyes remaining on the laminate. Marcus paused, his hand still on the thermostat. "What?"
"The bill," she repeated, pointing with her chin toward the kitchen table. "It's $85. It was due by 5 o'clock today." I didn't pay it. Marcus walked into the kitchen, his heavy boots leaving a trail of gray, melting slush on the linoleum. He snatched the yellow envelope from beneath the sugar bowl, tearing the top open with a jagged rip of his thumb. He pulled out the pink slip inside, his eyes scanning the numbers. "What do you mean you didn't pay it?" he asked, his voice rising, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and anger. "They're saying they're going to disconnect the service if they don't have the full amount within 10 days. Why didn't you pay it?" "I didn't have $85, she said. "You had the money from the ring," he snapped, waving the pink slip in front of her face. "You had $80 left. You told me you did." "I spent that on Friday," she said, her tone completely empty of the defensive heat he was trying to provoke. "I spent $40 on Lily's medicine. I spent $25 on Toby's lunch account so they wouldn't give him a cheese sandwich. I spent $15 on the bus pass to get to work. I have nothing left, Marcus." He stared at her, his jaw tightening, his chest rising and falling in short, angry breaths. "Well, what about your paycheck? You got paid on Thursday. Where is that money?" "That went to the rent," she said. "It's gone." "This is my name on this bill, Sarah," he muttered, his voice dropping into a low, threatening register as he pointed to the top of the warning notice. "Marcus Miller. It says it right there. If they shut off the power, it goes on my credit report. It ruins my record." Sarah rinsed her rag under the cold tap, her fingers turning numb as the icy water ran over her knuckles. She looked at him. She saw the raw, selfish panic in his eyes. He wasn't worried about the children being cold. He wasn't worried about the food in the refrigerator spoiling. He was worried about his name. He was worried about his credit score, the clean slate he had maintained by forcing her to drown hers in late fees and collections. For 9 years she had been his shield. She had skipped meals, lied to the electric company, and begged her sister for loans to ensure his name remained untouched, while he used their shared life as a betting chip. Now she was stepping aside. "You will have to pay it," she said. "With what?" he shouted. His frustration finally boiled over, his phone shaking in his hand. "I don't have $85. I have negative $48 in my account. I have to buy gas tomorrow just to get to the warehouse. How am I supposed to pay this?" "I don't know," she said. The 3 words were a perfect wall. They were polite, they were simple, and they offered him absolutely nothing to grab onto. Marcus stared at her, his mouth opening as if to yell, but the silence in the kitchen was too heavy. It was a cold, suffocating space that swallowed his anger before it could leave his throat. He looked at the pink slip in his hand, then looked at her calm, empty face, and realized, for the very first time, that she wasn't going to fix this. The safety net was gone. He let out a low, defeated growl, crumpled the pink slip into a tight ball, and threw it into the plastic trash can under the sink. He turned on his heel and walked back into the living room, slamming the door to his bedroom behind him with a crash that shook the dishes on the drying rack. Sarah served at the counter. She calculated the timeline. It was Monday night. By Thursday morning, $340
would be sitting in her new private account. By Friday morning, Marcus's automatic betting drafts would hit his empty joint account, triggering 3 separate $35 penalties. The power company would not disconnect the service for another 9 days. By then, she would have her second solo paycheck pending, and her cousin Richard's repayment schedule would be underway. She picked up her damp rag, wiped the last of the vinegar water from the counter, and turned off the kitchen light, leaving the room in a quiet, freezing darkness that felt exactly like freedom. The metal safety pins were cold and slightly oily to the touch. Sarah picked one from the plastic tray on her workbench, her fingers moving with steady, unhurried speed as she slid the sharp wire through the lapel of a heavy gray wool coat. She attached a small yellow paper tag numbered 486, snapped the pin shut, and slid the coat onto the conveyor line. It was Tuesday afternoon, just after 1 o'clock. The shop was loud with the rhythmic metallic hum of the automated conveyor system, which moved hundreds of clean garments through the ceiling tracks like a slow, floating army of ghosts. The air was thick with the scent of hot laundry starch and the faint, sweet chemical tang of the cleaning fluid. Sarah wiped her brow with the back of her sleeve, her skin damp from the steam. She looked toward the glass-walled office at the back of the shop. Mr. Henderson was sitting at his metal desk, writing in a large ledger book under the yellow light of his desk lamp. She adjusted her apron, walked down the narrow aisle between the pressing tables, and knocked gently on the glass door. Mr. Henderson looked up, sliding his glasses down his nose. "Yes, Sarah?" "I was wondering if I could leave an hour early today," she said, her voice quiet. "I have an appointment on 10th Street at 3. I can make up the hour on Saturday morning." He looked at the large wall clock above the conveyor. It was 1:15. He knew she had already processed 40 coats today, 10 more than her daily quota. He knew she never took extra smoke breaks, never complained about the heat, and never arrived late. "Go ahead, Sarah," he said, his voice flat but not unkind. "Just make sure the blue bins are sorted before you card out." "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," she said. She went back to her station, her movements quiet and efficient. She spent the next 45 minutes sorting the damp sheets from the wash bins, folding each one with neat square corners and stacking them on the wooden pallets. At exactly 2:30, she carded out, the old mechanical time clock letting out a loud, heavy, metallic chunk as it stamped her card. She walked to the employee locker room, a small, drafty space that smelled of wet boots and cheap tobacco. She unlocked her metal locker, took out her heavy winter coat, and slid her arms into the sleeves. Inside her large black canvas bag, beneath a clean hand towel and a spare pair of dry socks, lay her red spiral notebook and the 4 folded papers she had retrieved from her sewing box that morning. She walked out into the cold Tuesday afternoon. The wind on 10th Street was sharp, blowing dry autumn leaves and discarded plastic bags along the gutters. Sarah walked with her chin down, her hand gripping the strap of her bag tightly against her side. Her boots were heavy, but her feet were dry today, and the cold air felt clean after 5 hours of breathing steam. The county legal aid office was located on the second floor of a brick building with faded green trim, right between a discount furniture store and a shuttered butcher shop. The stairwell was narrow, smelling of old pine floor cleaner and damp plaster. She pushed open the heavy glass door at the top of the stairs. The waiting room was small and dim, illuminated by a single fluorescent tube that let out a high-pitched, vibrating hum. 6 rows of orange plastic chairs were lined up against the wood-paneled walls. A woman with a small baby asleep on her shoulder sat in the corner, her eyes fixed on a muted television screen that was playing an old game show. Behind a small glass window, a receptionist with short gray hair sat behind a massive pile of manila folders. "Name?" the receptionist asked, without looking up from her keyboard. "Sarah Miller," Sarah said. "I have a 3 o'clock appointment with the intake supervisor." The receptionist scanned a printed sheet on her desk, checked Sarah's name off with a blue highlighter, and slid a clipboard through the slot at the bottom of the window. "Fill these out," she said. "Sit anywhere." Sarah took the clipboard. She sat down in one of the hard orange plastic chairs, her thighs sticking slightly to the cold vinyl. She looked down at the paper. It was a 3-page intake form asking for her personal details, her employment history, her assets, her debts, and the names of her dependents. She began to fill out the form, her handwriting neat and small. She reached the section labeled Assets and Debts. She had to list her bank accounts. She wrote down her new First National Bank account number, and beside it she wrote the balance, 0. Her first direct deposit would not clear until Thursday morning. She wrote down the joint account number she shared with Marcus, and beside it she wrote the balance, negative $48.12. She reached the section labeled Liabilities of Spouse. She opened her red spiral notebook, resting it on her knees beneath the clipboard. She began to copy the numbers she had so carefully recorded over the last several weeks. She wrote down the $580 on the credit line. She wrote down the pawn ticket details. She wrote down the dates and amounts of the cash Marcus had taken from their home. She calculated the lost hour of work. Leaving the shop 60 minutes early had cost her exactly $9.50. To a woman with a negative bank account, $9.50 was a significant sum. It was 2 gallons of milk. It was a pack of penicillin for Lily. It was 3 days of bus fares. But as she wrote the numbers on the legal aid form, she knew the sacrifice was necessary. If she did not secure a legal shield now, Marcus's debts would follow her. When he fell deeper into the hole, his creditors would not care that she was the one who worked 60 hours a week. They would not care that she had sold her grandmother's ring to pay the rent. They would only see her signature on the joint account, her name on the lease, her labor as a resource they could exploit to recover his losses. She was building her fortress. She finished the 3rd page, checked her spelling, and slid her red notebook back into her canvas bag. "Mr. Miller!" a voice called out. Sarah looked up. A young woman in a dark blue blazer, her hair tied back in a neat bun, was standing in the doorway of the inner office, holding a yellow notepad. "I'm ready for you," the woman said, offering a small professional smile. Sarah stood up, her fingers gripping her canvas bag as she walked toward the open door, her face calm, her mind as quiet and sharp as the winter wind outside. The office of the intake attorney, Ms. Carter, was small and cluttered with cardboard banker boxes that stacked almost to the ceiling. The only window looked out onto the gray brick wall of the furniture store next door, and the air smelled of stale coffee, photocopy toner, and the dry, sweet scent of old paper files. Miss Carter was young, with sharp, dark eyes and a quick, efficient way of turning pages. She sat behind a metal desk, her fingers tapping a blue plastic ballpoint pen against her chin as she reviewed the pages Sarah had filled out. "Your list is very detailed, Mrs. Miller," Miss Carter said, her voice quiet and even. "Most people do not keep records like this." "I had to," Sarah said, her hands clasped tightly over her purse in her lap. "I needed to see where it was going." Miss Carter nodded, sliding her glasses up her nose to look at the red spiral notebook that lay open on the desk between them. She pointed to the entry for the $580. "This credit line ending in 493, she said. "You say it was opened in his name only?" "Yes," Sarah said. "I never signed for it. I didn't even know it existed until the collector called." "And you paid it off using a loan from your cousin?" Miss Carter asked. "Yes," Sarah said. "I have the bank transfer record from my cousin here." Miss Carter wrote a quick note on her yellow pad, her pen making a sharp scratching sound. "That is good, because the debt was in his name only, and you have proof that the funds used to clear it came from a third party as a personal loan to you. We can argue that this is his sole liability. It will not be considered marital debt in the division." She closed the red notebook and looked directly at Sarah. "The key to this, Mrs. Miller, is your physical departure," she said, her tone serious. "Under state law, financial abandonment is much easier to prove once you have established a separate residence. You mentioned you are applying for an apartment on 4th Street? "Yes," Sarah said. "The lease can start on the 1st of next month." Ms. Carter tapped her pen on the desk. "Excellent. We will prepare the divorce petition and the temporary custody motion now. We will coordinate the filing so that Marcus is served with the papers at his workplace on the exact morning you move. It is crucial that he has no idea what you are doing until the papers are in his hands." "Why?" Sarah asked. "Because when people realize they are losing control, they become unpredictable," Ms. Carter said, her voice dropping a fraction. "If he suspects you are leaving, he might try to withdraw whatever remains in your joint accounts. He might try to take the children or make promises he has no intention of keeping to get you to stay. You must keep doing exactly what you have been doing. Do not pack a single box where he can see it. Do not change your routine by even 5 minutes." "I understand," Sarah said. She stood up, her legs feeling slightly stiff. She shook Ms. Carter's hand, took her red notebook and the copies of her bank papers, and slid them back into her canvas bag. By 5:30, she was back in the duplex. The apartment was cold, the cheap baseboard heaters clicking softly in the quiet. Marcus was in the living room, but he was not on the sofa. He was sitting on the floor, his legs crossed, with his phone resting on the worn carpet in front of him. A small notebook lay beside him, covered in columns of names and tiny scribbled numbers. He was chewing his bottom lip, his eyes wide and vacant as he stared at the screen. He didn't look up when she entered. He didn't ask where she had been or why she was an hour late getting home from the dry cleaners. He had a frantic, vibrating energy about him, like a wire that had been stretched too tight. "Did you get any cash?" he asked, his voice a dry whisper, his eyes never leaving the screen. "No," Sarah said, hanging her coat on the peg behind the door. "I'm close, Sarah," he muttered, his thumb clicking the screen twice, his face illuminating in a sudden blue flare. I've got a guy who's giving me 3-1 on the Tuesday night games. Just 3-1. If I can get $50 by 8 o'clock, I can turn it into $150 before we go to sleep. We can pay the electric bill tomorrow. We can get the milk. I don't have $50, she said. She walked past him into the kitchen. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue with his math. She did not remind him that 3-1 was a fool's bet, or that his last sure thing had left their bank account $48 in the red. She began to make dinner. She measured out 2 small portions of white rice and a single can of black beans, placing the small pot over the blue flame of the stove. The kitchen smelled of vinegar and dry starch, a clean, sterile scent that she preferred to the sweet pine spray Marcus used. She calculated the days. It was Tuesday night. The first of the month was exactly 18 days away. 18 days of standing at the steam press for 8 hours a day. 18 days of walking past him in the narrow hallway. 18 days of watching him stare at his phone while the children ate dry toast and rice. She would have to play this part for 432 hours. She would have to look him in the eye every morning, make his tea, and listen to his empty promises, all while holding the white folded papers of her departure in her sewing box. She looked through the doorway at him. He was still on the floor, his face pale, his thumb moving across the glass in a rhythmic, desperate crawl. He was completely consumed by the illusion of his next win, entirely blind to the fact that the actual game had already ended and he had lost everything before he even realized she was playing. She took 2 blue plastic bowls from the cupboard, divided the rice and beans between them, and carried the plates to her children, her face a quiet, unbreakable wall of stone. The green light from the First National Bank ATM on Elm Street flickered against the cold, gray twilight of Thursday evening. Sarah stood before the terminal, her hand shielded by the collar of her winter coat, as she pressed her fingers against the cold plastic keys. The machine let out a series of internal clicks and hums, followed by the dry metallic zip of the receipt printer. She pulled the small slip of white paper from the slot. Your available balance is $340.00. She looked at the number. It was the exact amount of her weekly take-home pay from Henderson's Dry Cleaners. For the first time in 9 years, her labor had landed in a quiet, safe vault where Marcus's digital fingers could not reach it. She folded the receipt into a tiny square, slid it into her glove, and walked toward the bus stop, her steps light and steady on the cold sidewalk. When she turned the corner onto her street 40 minutes later, she smelled it before she even reached the concrete porch of the duplex. The smell of frying beef fat and heavy butter was thick in the cold air, drifting from their kitchen window. She pushed the front door open. The apartment was hot, the thermostat dial set to 74 degrees. In the kitchen, the air was dense with greasy white smoke because Marcus had not turned on the exhaust fan. 2 thick ribeye steaks were sizzling in a puddle of yellow butter in her old iron skillet, the meat curling at the edges as the fat scorched against the black iron. Marcus was standing by the stove, holding a pair of tongs. He was not wearing his gray hoodie. He was wearing a fresh, clean black t-shirt and his hair was neatly combed back. He was humming a quiet, cheerful tune, his shoulders relaxed, his face flushed with an ecstatic, vibrating energy. As she stepped into the kitchen, the light from the overhead bulb caught something on his left wrist. It was a heavy, gleaming band of polished stainless steel. The watch face was a deep, dark blue, protected by a thick, scratch-resistant sapphire crystal that reflected the yellow light like a small, perfect mirror. The silver hands moved around the dial in a smooth, continuous sweep, letting out a tiny mechanical tick that was completely lost in the hiss of the steak. Sarah stood by the pantry, her canvas bag hanging from her shoulder. "Look at this, Sarah," Marcus said, turning toward her with a wide, triumphant grin. He held his left wrist up, twisting his arm so the metal links of the watch caught the light. I told you I had a line on those Tuesday games. 3-1 direct. I took $40 and turned it into $1,200 by Wednesday midnight." She looked at the watch. It was a brand-name dive watch, the kind she had seen in the display case of the jewelers on 10th Street. It cost $750.
"I picked it up this afternoon," he said, his voice loud, full of the booming, arrogant confidence of a man who believed his own luck was an infinite resource. "It's an investment piece. The clerk said these models hold 90% of their retail value. I've been wanting one of these since we got married, Sarah. A real man's watch." "Did you pay the electric bill?" she asked, her voice a flat, level stone. Marcus's grin faltered, his shoulders tightening slightly. "The electric bill? Come on, Sarah. I just told you I won $1,200. We've got 9 days before they even think about turning the power off. I'll pay it next week when my warehouse check clears. Let me enjoy this, all right? I've been working 60 hours a week in that freezing warehouse. I earned this." "Did you buy the milk?" she asked. "I bought steaks," he said, gesturing with the tongs toward the smoking pan. "Real ribeyes, $20 a pound. We're eating like kings tonight. Forget about the milk. Toby can have water with his dinner." "Did you go to 10th Street?" she asked. He blinked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Yeah, to the jeweler. Why?" "Did you go to the pawn shop?" she asked, her voice quiet, her eyes remaining fixed on his face. "Did you get my mother's ring back?" Marcus froze. The sizzle of the steaks seemed to grow louder in the quiet of the room. He looked down at his new, gleaming watch, then looked back at her, his face flushing a deeper, angrier red. "The pawn shop? That ring was $80, Sarah. This watch is $750. It's a piece of machinery. It's an asset. Your grandmother's ring was just an old scrap of gold. We can get that back any time." The clerk said they hold pawned items for 90 days before they put them out. We've got plenty of time. He turned back to the stove, flipping one of the steaks with a hard, aggressive snap of his tongs. "You just can't stand to see me win, can you?" he muttered, his voice dropping into a bitter, resentful tone. "You want me to be down in the dirt with you. You want to walk around with that quiet, miserable face, so everyone thinks I'm the one who's ruining this family. But I'm the one who just brought $1,200 into this house. I'm the one who's feeding us tonight." Sarah did not answer him. She looked at his back, at the heavy silver watch ticking on his wrist, and then at the thin grease smoke rising toward the ceiling. She calculated the exact distance between them. It was no longer a financial gap. It was no longer a matter of $85 for the electric bill
or $340 for her rent deposit. It was a moral canyon, a deep black void that could never be filled by any amount of her labor or her sacrifice. He had won $1,200. Instead of paying the electric bill that sat in his name, instead of retrieving the thin gold band she had pawned to keep their children from being thrown onto the street, instead of buying a $4 carton of milk for his son, he had bought a $750 piece of stainless steel to slide over his wrist. She felt no anger. She felt no desire to scream or to throw the iron pan or to demand that he return the watch to the store. She only felt a deep, quiet sensation of absolute certainty. The final line had been crossed. She had played her part for 9 years, acting as the grease that kept his machine running while he ground her bones to dust. Now she was completely finished. "I'm going to wash my hands," she said, her voice soft and polite. She walked out of the kitchen, her steps silent and even, leaving him to watch his expensive steaks burn in their own grease under the yellow light of the smoking room. The brown cardboard box was small, but it was heavy with the weight of 30 years of sewing thread, steel needles, and old buttons. Sarah lifted the blue plastic sewing box, placing it carefully on top of the folded winter blankets at the back of the small pickup truck. Her cousin Richard stood by the tailgate, his gloved hands resting on the metal edge. He didn't ask questions. He had arrived at 7 o'clock in the morning, his truck empty, his face quiet and serious. He had helped her carry the 3 small mattresses, the kids' clothing bags, and the box of kitchen dishes down the narrow concrete steps of the duplex. It had taken exactly 45 minutes. Toby and Lily were already sitting in the cab of the truck, their small faces pressed against the rear glass, their eyes wide with a quiet, curious excitement. Lily was holding her favorite blue peg from the library game, her thumb tracing the smooth plastic edge. Inside the empty duplex, the silence was absolute. Sarah walked through the rooms one last time, her canvas shoes making a light, hollow tap on the bare floorboards. The living room looked smaller now, the carpet showing a dark, dusty rectangle where the old sofa had sat for 9 years. The air was cold, smelling of stale pine spray, and the faint, sour tang of the vinegar she had used to clean the walls. She walked into the kitchen. On the bare laminate counter, sitting right next to the rusted sink, lay the empty white cardboard watch box. It was a beautiful box, lined with black velvet, with a small silk ribbon designed to hold a $750 piece of polished steel. The watch was on Marcus's wrist, but the empty box was here, a hollow monument to his victory. Beside the box, Sarah placed a thick, white manila envelope. Inside were the temporary custody motion, the financial separation disclosure, and the divorce petition. At exactly 10 o'clock, a professional process server would walk through the bay doors of the West Side Auto Parts warehouse. He would ask for Marcus Miller. He would hand him a matching white envelope in front of his supervisor and his coworkers, while the heavy forklift engines roared in the background. Marcus would look at the papers. He would realize his joint account was frozen, his credit line was isolated, and his home was empty. Sarah reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out her phone. She opened her messaging app and scrolled down to the 10-digit sequence with the local area code,
the unknown number that had sent her the warning about the $580 credit line. She typed a single brief message. Marcus Miller is currently at the West Side Auto Parts Warehouse, Dock 4, until 5 p.m. He is wearing a $750 stainless steel watch on his left wrist and has $1,200 in cash in his pocket. She pressed the blue send button. She did not feel malice. She did not feel the hot, burning sting of revenge. She only felt the quiet, clinical satisfaction of a ledger being balanced. For 9 years she had carried his weight, absorbing his debts and hiding his secrets, while her own life turned to dust. She had simply stepped aside. She had untethered the boat, letting the current carry him toward the rocks he had spent a decade building. She turned off her phone, slid it into her pocket, and walked out the front door. She pulled the heavy wooden door closed behind her, the lock clicking into place with a sharp, clean sound of finality. She left the key on the concrete porch windowsill, just as she had agreed with the landlord, and climbed into the cab of Richard's truck. The drive to 4th Street was short, the winter sun finally breaking through the gray clouds, casting a pale, bright light across the wet streets. The new apartment was warm. It was located on the 2nd floor, directly above the Italian bakery. The air inside smelled of yeast, warm flour, and sweet sugar, a rich, comforting scent that seemed to rise through the clean floorboards like a promise. The walls were painted a fresh, bright cream, and the windows were large, letting the pale morning light flood the small living room. Toby immediately ran to the window, looking down at the bakery delivery van on the street below. "Mom," he called out, his voice bright and clear, "there's a park at the corner. I can see the swings." "I see them, Toby," Sarah said, her voice softer and warmer than it had been in years. She sat down at the small wooden table Richard had helped her carry up the stairs. It was a simple table, but it was sturdy and the wood was clean. She placed her fake leather purse on the surface, unzipped the compartment, and took out her new First National Bank debit card. She had $340. She had her dignity. She had her children. She looked at her left hand. The pale, thin circle of skin on her ring finger was still there, but in the bright light of the new kitchen, it no longer looked like an empty space. It looked like a clean slate. Sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is to stop carrying a weight that was never theirs to bear. If this story reminded you that family should never take love for granted, you are not alone. In this life, we are often told to endure, to sacrifice, and to keep quiet for the sake of peace. But true peace can never be built on the slow, silent destruction of your own soul. What would you have done if you were in Sarah's shoes? Would you have stayed to protect his name? Or would you have walked away to save your children? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy meaningful family stories that explore love, resilience, and the quiet strength of second chances, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your presence here means everything to us, and we look forward to sharing more journeys of survival and hope with you. In the end, she realized that the most precious thing she had ever pawned was her own silence, and today she had finally bought it back.